I woke up at 4:30 a.m. to the harsh buzzing of the clock, its drone echoing off the wet walls of my studio apartment. Although my body had long since adapted to this crazy routine, I kept the alarm as a reminder of how my life used to be. Waking up early once meant more than just avoiding the annoying stares at work. It was a time when I felt more connected to my family. The pictures on my wall seemed to mock me in the pre-dawn darkness. My daughter's graduation photo, taken 5 years ago, captured her mid-laugh, blissfully unaware that in just 2 years she would stop calling. My son's last Little League game, where he threw a perfect inning, felt like a distant memory. Now, he answers my texts with single-word replies, if he responds at all. The frames holding these memories were so dirty that I couldn't bring myself to clean them or take them down. My morning routine had become a well-practiced dance of resignation. Instant coffee that tasted like warm dirt, the same wrinkled uniform worn all week, and a frozen breakfast sandwich that never quite thawed in the middle. My name tag, with Tony written in worn letters and a Y that was hard to see after years of use, identified me as a repair engineer, a fancy title for someone who spent their days fixing rusted bolts and greasing old chains. The drive to Paradise Park was always strange at this hour. Orlando's usually bustling streets were empty, save for the occasional delivery truck or early morning runner. The park's entrance loomed ahead, its once bright colors now dulled by years of Florida sun and neglect. The big smiling sun logo above the gate had a crack running through it, making its cheerful face resemble more of a grimace. As I walked in, I heard my supervisor, Mendoza's words, carry across the empty parking lot. Dave was already sweating in the humid morning air, his safety vest pressing against his belly. "Got a special job for you today," he said. I knew what was coming before he even said it. The younger workers had been talking about it all week, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever I passed by. The Soul Ripper, the park's infamous haunted roller coaster, had been acting up again. "The cameras are going haywire," Dave explained, not meeting my eyes. "Weight ranges all wrong. Emergency stops sparking for no reason. Keep it quiet, though. Last thing we need is more bad press." I nodded, accepting the work order with steady hands that betrayed my unease. 20 years ago, I had designed rides like this across the country. My name had meant something in the business. Now, I found myself reduced to maintaining a dying attraction in a failing park. But machines still made sense to me. They followed rules and patterns, and they could be fixed. If only I had known then that the Soul Ripper's patterns weren't mechanical at all, but something far more sinister. The repair locker beneath the Soul Ripper was a world unto itself. At 5:15 a.m., the metal stairs leading down creaked beneath my weight, each step ringing in the darkness like someone following closely behind. The air grew thicker as I descended, bringing with it that peculiar mix of motor oil, metal shavings, and something else, something that reminded me of old pennies and decay. My keyring held 15 similar-looking keys, but my fingers instinctively found the right one. The lock always stuck on humid mornings, needing a specific twist and pull motion I had mastered over the months. Today, however, it turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if someone had recently oiled it. The fluorescent lights buzzed reluctantly to life when I flipped the switch, throwing an uneven glow across the cramped space. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by shelves overcrowded with extra parts and forgotten tools. A half-empty bottle of industrial cleaner cast a particularly disturbing silhouette, resembling a hunched figure watching from the corner. I needed the repair manual. It should have been where it always was, on the metal desk bolted to the far wall. Instead, I found it tucked behind a stack of old work orders, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands. The pages felt different today, warmer, almost alive against my fingers. That's when I noticed the writing. It wasn't the standard maintenance logs or inspection notes. These were messages scrawled in the margins, the handwriting becoming increasingly frantic as it spiraled around the technical sketches. The ink seemed fresher on some notes than others, as if multiple people had added to them over time. The first rule caught my eye immediately. Always grease the third card at the start of your shift, even if it doesn't need it. I had worked on hundreds of rides in my career and written dozens of maintenance protocols. Nothing ever needed such specific, seemingly random maintenance. My eyes traced down the page, finding more rules, each more bizarre than the last. Do not study the tracks between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. You won't be alone. A metallic tapping sound echoed from somewhere behind me. I whirled around, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but found nothing, just the normal clutter of tools and extra parts. As I turned back to the manual, I could have sworn one of the wrenches on the workbench had moved slightly. The final rule was written larger than the others. The letters pressed so deeply into the page, they nearly tore through the instructions. Must stay in the locker. Taking it anywhere else will wake them. Another tap, closer this time, then another, like footsteps on metal moving across the ceiling. I told myself it was just the ride settling, metal contracting in the morning air. 20 years of engineering knowledge said that's all it could be, but engineering knowledge didn't explain why my image in the locker's small mirror seemed to lag slightly behind my movements, or why. When I looked at the manual again, the handwriting seemed to shift and change, like living things moving across the page. A drop of water, at least I hoped it was water, fell from somewhere above, landing on the open manual. The liquid was dark, too dark, and as it soaked into the page, the words around it seemed to writhe. The tapping had stopped, and the quiet that replaced it felt anxious, as if the whole room was holding its breath, waiting. I slammed the manual shut, my heart pounding against my ribs as the fluorescent light flickered once, twice. In those fleeting moments of darkness, I could have sworn I saw other reflections in the mirror, faces that weren't mine, mouths opened in silent screams. As dawn broke, I climbed the repair ladder to the track, the metal rungs slick with morning dew. The Soul Ripper loomed above me, its twisted track silhouetted against the purple-orange sky like a grotesque skeleton. With 20 years of engineering experience, I knew the third cart couldn't possibly need grease. We had done a full maintenance check just last week. Yet, the words in the instructions pulsed in my mind like an urgent whisper I couldn't ignore. Before me stretched a lineup of 12 similar vehicles, their black paint scratched and faded from years of exposure to the Florida sun. The third cart sat innocently among them, nothing outwardly special about it. I ran my standard checks: safety restraints, wheel alignment, brake pads. Everything was perfect, exactly as it should be. However, my hand trembled slightly as I reached for the grease gun, its weight feeling wrong. as if it had grown heavier since yesterday. As I positioned it near the wheel assembly, something odd caught my eye. Tiny scratches around the grease fittings, arranged in shapes that almost looked like letters. The first drop of grease hit the fitting, and the metal gave an audible sigh. Not the normal release of air, but something that sounded almost relieved. The sound echoed through the entire track, making the rail beneath my feet shake at a frequency that set my teeth on edge. Movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just my shadow stretching long across the track in the rising sun. But shadows don't move against the light. Shadows don't have depth, and surely shadows don't watch you with empty, hungry eyes. I forced myself to keep working, carefully applying grease to each fitting. With each pump of the gun, the temperature seemed to drop until I could see my breath hanging in the air, impossible for a Florida morning. The grease itself changed color, turning darker, almost black, as it entered the mechanism. A whisper of movement made me turn toward the ride's entrance. The gargoyles, those ugly concrete monstrosities that had always seemed like a cheap addition to the ride, had changed. I was certain they had been facing outward when I started. Their grotesque faces leered at approaching guests. Now they stared inward, their stone eyes fixed on the exact spot where I stood. Rule 3 slammed into my mind. If the gargoyles at the entrance are looking inward, leave the park immediately. My hands fumbled with the grease gun, nearly dropping it as I attached it to my tool belt. The metal walkway swayed slightly under my feet as I moved toward the repair ladder, each step echoing metallically through the building. The echo came back wrong, like there were too many footsteps, some moving in different directions. The third cart creaked behind me, its safety restraint slowly rising on its own with a hydraulic hiss. In the rising light, I could see dark spots on the seat that hadn't been there before, spreading like ink across the fabric. I practically flew down the ladder, my feet barely hitting the rungs. The maintenance locker offered a fool's sanctuary, but it was better than being exposed on the track. As I yanked the door open, a sound floated down from above, the mechanical whir of the ride powering up. But the power wasn't meant to be connected for another 2 hours. The control panel in the box above still showed dark and dead, yet I could hear the chain lift engaging, the rhythmic click, click, click of a cart being pulled up the first hill, and underneath that familiar sound, something else, a low, pleased hum like a predator finally finding its prey. I slammed the locker door behind me, hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. In the small mirror on the wall, I caught a glimpse of my face, pale, sweating, eyes wide, with barely contained panic. But for a split second, between one blink and the next, it wasn't my face at all. It was someone else's, someone whose eyes held the same terror I felt, their mouth frozen in a silent scream. The tapping had started again, making its way across the roof toward the door. This time it sounded like something counting. The park closed at 9 p.m., but darkness had crept in hours earlier, bringing with it a thick blanket of humidity that made the air feel like soup. I had spent the day dodging the Soul Ripper, finding excuses to work on other rides, a stuck safety bar on the carousel, a faulty sensor on the Ferris wheel. But now, with the last stragglers heading toward the doors, I couldn't put it off any longer. The final maintenance check was required by park policy, a 20-minute inspection that stretched into an infinity under the flickering sodium lights. Paradise Park was different after hours. The cheerful music that usually masked the groan of aging machinery had stopped, leaving only the faraway hum of the parking lot lights and the soft buzz of insects drawn to their glow. My footsteps echoed weirdly on the concrete, as if the sound was being swallowed by something just out of sight. The air felt thick, charged with an unsettling energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, knowing that the Soul Ripper was waiting, and whatever was lurking in the shadows was not just a figment of my imagination. I checked my watch. 9:47 p.m. The massive frame of the Soul Ripper cut a jagged hole in the star-filled sky above, its black outline seeming to shift and sway, even though the ride sat motionless. The usual safety lights along the track were out, all of them, which was impossible according to every safety rule I had ever written. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks with the metal frame, but wind doesn't giggle. Wind doesn't sound like children whispering secrets in the dark. The laughter floated down from the queue area, high-pitched and musical, carrying an undercurrent of something that made my skin crawl. Rule 5 burned in my mind. If you hear laughing coming from the queue after the park closes, do not explore. I gripped my flashlight tighter, its beam weak against the encroaching darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to walk away, to forget about the required inspection. But 20 years of professional pride kept my feet moving forward, even as the laughter grew louder and more distinct. The queue area was a maze of curves and metal railings, all leading to the loading platform. My flashlight beam caught movement ahead. The turnstiles were spinning slowly, clicking through their turns as if invisible people were passing through. The small counter display ticked upward. 1, 2, 3. The laughter changed, dropping in pitch until it no longer sounded childlike at all. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the metal fences, seeming to circle around me like a predator watching its prey. In the brief sweeps of my flashlight, I caught glimpses of impossible things: shadows moving against shadow, faces pushing through the metal bars as if they were made of putty, hands reaching out only to dissolve when the light touched them. The temperature dropped, and my breath came out in invisible puffs, each one taking away a little more of my warmth, my courage, my rationality. The counter kept ticking. 7, 8, 9. Something brushed against my back, a touch so cold it burned through my uniform shirt. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. In its strobing light, I saw them. Figures standing in the queue lines, their forms flashing like bad television reception. Each one wore the same look of frozen terror, their mouths open in quiet screams. The turnstile made one final click. 13. My flashlight died, plunging me into sudden darkness. The laughter returned, no longer trying to sound human, no longer trying to hide its hunger. It rose from the depths of the queue area, like smoke, wrapping around me with fingers of sound that pressed against my ears, my eyes, my mouth, trying to find a way in. I ran, and behind me, the control panel in the operator's booth suddenly blazed to life, its switches and buttons flicking on their own as the systems engaged. The chain lift started its usual climb, but the sound was wrong, wet somehow, like metal grinding against something soft and yielding. As I reached the relative safety of the maintenance shed, I heard the distinct click of safety belts locking into place, followed by the sound of the ride beginning its first drop. But there was something else mixed in with the mechanical noises, screams that couldn't possibly be coming from empty cars. Morning came too soon, bringing with it Dave's demand for running test cycles. Corporate was sending testers next week, he said, not meeting my eyes. Need to make sure everything's going smooth. I wanted to tell him about the laughter, about the turnstiles moving on their own, about the impossible shadows that had chased me through the darkness. But 20 years in the business had taught me what happened to maintenance workers who started talking about spooky rides. Instead, I nodded and climbed the steps to the control booth. The morning sun did nothing to dispel the strange atmosphere that clung to the Soul Ripper. If anything, the harsh light made it worse, revealing details I had somehow never noticed before. The way the tracks twisted made patterns that hurt my eyes to look at, how the paint seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the slight wrongness in the angles of the support beams. The pre-ride checklist appeared normal. Power systems, brake lines, safety sensors, everything read normal on the digital displays, though the screens seemed to flicker ominously. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, lurking just beneath the surface of the ride I had known for so long. Whenever I looked away, I noticed numbers changing in my peripheral vision, only to snap back when I focused on them. I started the test cycle, watching as the empty train of cars began its ascent up the first hill. The weight sensors blinked to life, showing the load spread across each car, and my heart stopped. The sensors displayed an odd number of people. Rule 4 screamed in my head, never allow an odd number of people on the ride. If it happens, manually shut it down before the final drop. My hands flew to the emergency stop button, but it wouldn't lower. The plastic was warm to the touch, almost hot, and seemed to pulse under my fingers, like something alive. The ride continued its ascent, the chain lift's regular clicking sounding more and more like laughter with each passing second. I tried the backup stop, the circuit breakers, even the main power switch. Nothing replied. The ride was in control now, and it knew I knew. Through the booth's windows, I could see each car clearly as they crested the first hill. Empty. All of them empty. Yet the weight sensors continued their impossible readout, showing a single person somewhere in the train. The front car reached the top, and for a split second, I saw it. A figure sitting in the front seat, its form like a tear in reality, darkness spilling out around its edges. It turned to look at me, and where its face should have been was something wrong. Like someone had taken all the math I understood about the human form and twisted it into something that shouldn't exist. I stumbled back from the window, my hip hitting the edge of the control panel. Static electricity crackled between my fingers and the metal surface, and in that moment, all the TVs went black. When they flickered back to life, every panel showed the same message. You shouldn't have read the rules. The ride plunged down its first drop, and the scream that rang across the park wasn't mechanical at all. It was the sound of something old and hungry finally breaking free. Through the booth's window, I watched in horror as dark liquid began seeping from the track joints, running down the support beams in thick rivulets. The third car, the one I had greased just yesterday, was leaving a trail of that same darkness behind it. like an ink stain spreading across the morning sky. When the train hit the final brake run, I forced myself to look at the front car. It was empty again, but the seat was wet, shining with something that moved, even when the car was perfectly still. The weight sensors finally went dark, but not before showing one last reading: 0 passengers. Not empty, 0, as if whatever had been riding had taken from reality itself. After that morning, the Soul Ripper began to change. Subtle at first, so slight I thought lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. But with each passing day, the changes became more obvious, more impossible to ignore. It started with the mirrored panels that lined the queue area. They had always been there, cheap funhouse mirrors added to entertain guests waiting in line. But now they showed something else. Not reflections, but memories. The first one I saw during my morning inspection featured a teenage boy, maybe 16, his Letterman jacket bright against the dark metal of the ride. He was laughing, high-fiving friends I couldn't see. The timestamp in the corner read June 15th, 1998. I remembered his face from the missing persons database I had obsessively searched after that first night. Marcus Chen, who vanished during grad night 25 years ago. The picture lasted only seconds before dissolving into ordinary thought. But by afternoon, more had appeared, a young couple in matching Disney shirts, holding hands as they waited in line. Sarah and Tom Reynolds had vanished during their honeymoon in 2003. Their faces were caught mid-smile, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Each glimpse into the mirrors revealed more lost souls, memories trapped in a twisted reflection of time. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I realized that the Soul Ripper was not just a ride. It had become a conduit for something far more sinister, a collector of lost lives, and I was now part of its dark narrative. They'd never leave the park. Each panel became a view into the Soul Ripper's history of fear. A family of 3 waving at a camera that no longer existed. A group of college kids making silly faces. A little girl in a princess dress, cotton candy, coloring her lips blue. All of them real, all of them gone. I spent hours documenting each look, cross-referencing faces against missing persons reports. The ride was showing me its prizes, its collection of stolen souls. Some images were crystal clear, while others looked distorted, like photographs left too long in water. But all of them held the same terrible knowledge in their eyes, apparent in their last captured moments. The understanding that something was wrong, that the ride they'd boarded wasn't just a roller coaster. Late that night, as I was locking up the repair locker, my own reflection caught my eye in the small mirror on the wall. For a moment, it looked normal. Then the image began to change. My face stayed, but it wasn't the present me. It was younger, from 20 years ago, when I still built rides. I watched in horror as dark liquid started seeping from my reflection's eyes, nose, and mouth. My skin grew pale and transparent, like something that had lived too long in the dark. The reflection moved independently, reaching out as if pressing against the glass from the other side. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and behind it, I could see others. Hundreds of faces, all pressed together, all trying to break through the mirror. The mirror cracked in a spiderweb design, each piece showing a different victim. Their voices began to filter through, a chaos of whispers that made my ears bleed. You read the rules. You know what it is now. It's been so hungry. You're next, you're next, you're next. I fled the locker, but not before seeing my image one last time. It wasn't yelling anymore. It was smiling, and behind its teeth, I could see the same darkness that leaked from the ride's joints, that stained the third car's seats, that filled the places between reality where the Soul Ripper had worn them thin. The ride had been collecting souls for decades, gathering them in every reflective surface, every shadow, every place where light couldn't quite reach. And now it was showing them to me, not as a warning, I realized, but as a promise. Because in every mirror, in every memory, it showed me my face was starting to appear in the background, watching, waiting, already there, even in scenes from years before I'd started working at the park. The Soul Ripper wasn't just showing me its past victims, it was showing me my future. The choice came at 3 a.m., in that hollow place between night and morning, where reality feels thinnest. I had to end it. 20 years of engineering knowledge told me every ride had a breaking point, even cursed ones. I'd spent days studying the original plans, looking for vulnerabilities. The control panel on the highest point of the lift hill controlled everything: main systems, backups, even the antique hydraulics from the original building. Destroy that, and the whole ride would be dead, or so I told myself. My hands shook as I loaded my toolbox: wrench, wire cutters, screwdrivers, normal tools for a regular repair job. The weight felt wrong, though, like the metal had become denser, heavy with purpose. The manual sat on my workbench, its pages now stained with that dark liquid that seemed to seep from everywhere. The maintenance ladder felt endless, each rung burning cold against my palms. The metal almost brittle in the pre-dawn air. The laughing started around the 20th step, that high, childish giggle that had haunted my dreams for weeks. Only now it came from above, not the queue area halfway up. I made the mistake of looking down. The ground below had changed, stretching away into impossible distances as if the ride had grown bigger while I climbed. The park's lights twisted in nauseating patterns, making symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. Just machinery, I whispered, my breath visible in the strangely cold air. Just gears and motors. But the metal under my hands pulsed like a heartbeat. At the top platform, the wind howled with voices I recognized. Some of them now. Marcus Chen's teenage laughter, Sarah Reynolds calling her husband's name, that little girl in the princess dress asking if the ride was scary. The control panel loomed before me, its surfaces mirroring faces that shouldn't be there. I reached for my tools, but the kit had changed. The metal had gone black, not with paint, but with depth, as if it had become a window into total darkness. When I touched it, ripples spread across its surface like disturbed water. The manual's warning rang in my mind. Taking it anywhere else will wake them. Too late, I realized my mistake. In my desire to end this, I'd brought both the manual and my tools up here, away from the locker. The control panel exploded in sparks, but they fell upward, defying gravity. Each spark contained a face, a memory, a scream. The ride groaned, a sound so deep it rattled my bones and made my teeth ache. The entire building began to move, not like a machine, but like something living, stretching after a long sleep. Dark liquid began pouring from every joint and seam, running upward instead of down, gathering in a writhing mass above the platform. In its depths, I saw faces, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. Every victim the Soul Ripper had ever claimed, now part of its hideous anatomy. My tools melted, bleeding that same darkness. The manual's pages flew open on their own, the rules now writing themselves across every surface of the platform in that same frantic script. You shouldn't have brought us up here. You shouldn't have tried to break it. You shouldn't have read the rules. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. The darkness reached for me, with hands made of shadow and memory, each finger tipped with mirrored surfaces, showing my own face contorted in terror. The wind carried the sound of metal tearing, but under that, I heard something worse. The Soul Ripper wasn't just awake now, it was hungry. Paradise Park opened right on time the next morning. The sun rose over Orlando like it always did, painting the sky in cotton candy colors that seemed obscene after what had happened in the dark hours before dawn. The parking lot filled with minivans and excited children, none of them noticing that the Soul Ripper's black frame seemed darker today, its edges somehow sharper against the morning sky. No one reported Tony Mendoza missing. In a theme park with high turnover and minimum wage workers, people went all the time. They moved on, found better jobs, gave up. Dave simply marked it as another retirement, though his hands shook as he filed the paperwork. The Soul Ripper ran perfectly that day. Its machinery purred with a new ease, as if something had finally clicked into place. The lines were longer than usual, guests drawn to the ride's improved appearance. The paint looked fresher, the metal gleamed, and even the gargoyles seemed more vivid, more alive. In the middle of the afternoon, a 12-year-old girl named Emma Williams noticed something strange as her car topped the first hill. The metal surface beside her seat had become reflective, like a mirror. In it, she saw a man's face, tired, haunted, his clothes stained with something dark that moved like oil. He seemed to be trying to say something, his mouth moving hurriedly, forming the same words over and over. Read the rules. Please read the rules. But the car had already started its descent. In the control booth, the weight sensors showed impossible readings, numbers that went backward, percentages greater than 100, negative masses that made the computer screens glitch and distort. The ride operator blinked, and for a moment, all the screens showed the same message. Tony says hello. By closing time, no one remembered the girl in car 3 or noticed that her photo had already appeared in the mirrored panels along the queue, her face frozen in that exact moment of awareness. She became another trophy in the Soul Ripper's collection, another memory stuck in its twisted frame. In the maintenance locker, the manual sat idly on its shelf, its pages now containing a new rule written in fresh, dark ink. If you see Tony in the mirrors, run. He's not trying to tell you anymore. He's trying to feed. The next morning, a new repair worker found a set of rules scrawled in the edges. The first one caught his eye immediately. Always grease the third car at the start of your shift, even if it doesn't need it. Above the park, the Soul Ripper's silhouette seemed to shift in the rising sun, its track twisting into impossible patterns before settling back into its familiar shape. The gargoyles turned their heads inward, their stone faces split by hungry grins. The ride had changed that night, evolved. It wasn't just cursed anymore. It had become something else entirely. Every bolt, every wire, every inch of track now pulsed with the combined energy of its victims. Their souls had become its fuel, their memories its consciousness, their screams its voice. And in every mirrored surface, the metal track, the safety straps, the mirrors in the queue, Tony's face watched and waited. He had become part of it now, not just another trapped soul, but something worse, an ambassador, a draw, a recruiter for its ever-growing hunger. The Soul Ripper had finally found the right maintenance worker, one who would stay with it forever, one who understood machinery, who knew how to keep it going, who could help it feed, one who had read the rules and, in reading them, had become part of them. The park speakers crackled to life, playing their happy morning music. But underneath the music, if you listened carefully, you could hear other sounds. The clicking of machinery that moved too smoothly to be purely mechanical. The whispers of trapped souls. And the soft, steady sound of Tony's laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the ride's dark heart. The Soul Ripper was ready for another day of business, and it was always looking for new maintenance workers.